Great. Awesome. Well, happy Friday, everyone. Thank you guys for jumping on the webinar on a Friday afternoon. My name is Brooke Boudreau, like Mark said, and I'm excited to talk about cost allocation plans. Today, I first was introduced kind of to cost allocations, got my feet wet with 2CFR, all of that good stuff, during my role as an operations manager at The Landing. They are a daytime drop-in center supporting survivors of human trafficking in Houston. So some of you guys may be familiar with The Landing, and had the opportunity to really shape out a lot of this stuff at The Landing. And so that was a really fun time. Now I am at Good Reason Houston, an education-centered nonprofit working with public schools, specifically in the Houston area. So excited to be here today. And then, yeah, I'll be on the lookout for questions in the chat, Roger, if you want to field them, if you feel like it's relevant as we're going along. If not, we'll definitely have some Q&A. Okay. So our agenda is going to be pretty straightforward, but we're going to talk about what a cost allocation plan is today. And then we're going to talk about kind of the nuts and bolts of it, how a cost allocation plan can be used by a nonprofit organization, and then some of the specific methodologies that you can use as you're beginning to shape out your cost allocation plans. Okay, so we'll start at a very high level, but a cost allocation plan is essentially a way for organizations to um, think about and apply their kind of management and general administrative costs across multiple different programs or projects that they impact. So our cost allocation plan is going to not only define those costs, but it's going to begin to determine how those costs are allocated and kind of creating a methodology for allocating some of these various costs, ultimately to get some, cost recovery if you have specific grants that, you want to be able to think about how your administrative costs factor into some of those different activities. So here's kind of our roadmap, if you will, for the next 20 to 30 minutes. What we're going to do is we're going to start by defining what our costs are as an organization. We're going to determine our different allocation methods that are available to us. And then we're going to take those pieces and ultimately document them into a cost allocation plan. I have some different examples that we'll use throughout, and then I'll also speak just anecdotally to how I've done this in some of the work that I've done as well. So we'll start with determining our costs. Okay, so most of you may be familiar with our functional expenses and how, our expenses as an organization are bucketed into three main categories functionally. So we have our programmatic activities, we have our support services that then branch into our administrative activities and our fundraising activities. And to go into a little bit more detail about each of these three buckets, I'll start with our programmatic activities. So these might feel rather obvious, but these are any activities or expenses that are related directly to your organization's mission. So, at The Landing, we operated a daytime drop-in center. A lot of those programmatic activities were things that we spent that were related directly to operating the drop-in center and supporting those clients. These can also be activities that, are performed with respect to a restricted funding source or a grant, things of that nature. Your management and general activities might be a little bit harder to like put your finger on, right? Which is why we're talking about cost allocation. But these are things that are necessary to run your nonprofit organization, but maybe don't correlate specifically to a particular program that you run. So these could be things like your accounting function, maybe it's your audit, any insurance or general overhead costs that you incur as an organization. Facility costs can even be captured here. So some of those things go under management in general. And then your fundraising activities, this one again feels, particularly obvious, but it's anything that you're spending that drives dollars in the door for your organization. So it's your communication efforts, your donor-related activities, any fundraising events that you put on, your fundraising personnel, etc. So, all of your expenses that you have as a nonprofit organization should be able to fall into one of these three categories of your functional expense. And for purposes of today in your cost allocation plan, we're actually just going to be thinking about our programmatic activities and our management and general activities. And if you're familiar with the 2 CFR at all, but essentially fundraising activities are not allowable expenses to allocate to federal awards or to particular program activities. And so as we're thinking about the cost allocation plan in the context of the 2 CFR, we're going to be thinking about specifically our management and general activities and our programmatic activities. Okay, so we've defined and determined our costs, right? We have our functional expenses, our three different buckets. And now we're going to take specifically our program activities and our management and general activities, and we're going to begin to determine our allocation method for these specific expenses. And again, I've mentioned the 2 CFR a couple of times, but I do want to name it here explicitly. And I have at the end of our slides a resource page that links directly to the 2 CFR online. I definitely encourage you to take a look at it if you haven't, and to kind of anchor into that as you're developing your cost allocation plan. But essentially, the 2 CFR outlines that there's three different allocation methods that can be used to allocate your costs. We're going to be focusing specifically on the direct method today. It is the most common method of cost allocation. Of course, there's also the simplified method and the multiple distribution-based method. Again, that's not really the scope of today's conversation, but if you do have curiosities around those two allocation methods, I definitely recommend reaching out to Mark and the TASA team afterwards to talk more about what those methodologies look like. Okay, so in allocating our costs, again, we're going to talk specifically about the direct allocation method. And really what that means is we're going to be looking at costs that can be directly attributed to a particular program or function. And because of that, they're distributed directly to the program or project that they benefit. And there's a couple of different methods that fall under the direct allocation method that we'll talk about here next. So the four main types of direct allocation that we'll talk about today are time and effort reporting, FTE method, square footage allocation, and actual usage. I do want to name that as you're thinking about how to allocate your costs, which method to use, every organization is going to do this differently, and it's going to look a little different across organizations. So it would be really easy to just say like, okay, this is how you should allocate your rent. This is how you should allocate, your printer costs. But, every organization does it differently, and it really does depend on, your activities of your organization. And so I just want to name that. Um, and kind of using that lens to go into as we're choosing our allocation method, there might be different ways that you can do it. But really, you need to anchor into these four things when you're thinking about determining your allocation method for your expenses. The first and foremost is that your costs are reasonable, allowable, and allocable. So again, going back to the allowable piece, fundraising expenses are not allowable on federal grant awards, and so that right there is something that you should kind of think about in this context as you're framing your allocation method. Um, are your is your allocation method consistent year over year? You want to make sure that whatever allocation method you are going to use for your personnel and for your operating expenses, that it's justifiable and consistent year over year, that you're not frequently changing what that looks like. Um, it should be reviewed and approved by management. And then, of course, your methodologies should be defendable. And this one is important in the confines of kind of outlining what these expenses look like on your cost allocation plan. We'll talk about some different ways that you can actually define them and defend them as we go along. Okay, so we'll start with time and effort reporting allocation method. This is the most common methodology for allocating your expenses. And really, it's used to determine how your personnel should be allocated functionally. And when I reference personnel, I mean any of the wages for your personnel and the benefits that go along with your team. And so here we have an example of a very small but mighty nonprofit and some of the personnel that they may have on their roster. So you have an executive director, we have a bookkeeper, we have a grant writer, and then we have two programmatic personnel. We have a case manager and an advocate. So you can see that there's 5 total FTEs, or full-time equivalents. And total salary is $155,000. The 3 buckets that are bordered over on the right-hand side, again, is referring to our functional expenses. So you have your program 1, your management in general, cost category, and your fundraising. Now, if you have multiple different programs or multiple different grants, you'll have, of course, more than one program here, but for illustration purposes, we have just one program, M&G, and your fundraising cost centers. We're then going to begin allocating our personnel across these 3 buckets using the time and effort methodology. Now, if you attended Roger's webinar on time and effort reporting, you are very much in the know and well equipped to just take what you learned there and apply it to allocating your costs. And if you haven't seen that webinar yet, definitely recommend you check it out on the YouTube channel. But essentially, we're using our time and effort reporting method, which is a way to essentially assess how our personnel are spending their time across the different programs and activities, and then using their actual time spent to allocate the costs related to that functionally. So say we had the results of a time and effort report from an executive director that showed that they spend about 25% of their time on Program 1 activities, 25% of their time on management and general activities, and about half of their time on fundraising activities, we could then say that for their salary of $50,000, that we will allocate 12,500 of their salary to Program 1, 12,500 to the Management and General Cost Center, and 25,000 or half of their salary to fundraising, the Fundraising Cost Center. And we essentially do that for all of our personnel. I do want to call attention again to when we're thinking about our allocation, criteria and the allowability of those things. We do have, our grant writer here listed at 100% of their fundraising cost, right? For simplicity purposes, we had listed that the bookkeeper has 100% of their time spent on management in general. You could also, after doing your time and effort study, determine that the bookkeeper is actually spending some time on grant reporting for Program 1. So maybe they actually have a little bit of time allocated here. But just keep in mind kind of the reasonableness and the allowability of your expenses with that frame of reference. And then we're looking at our two program personnel, our case manager and our advocate. And you can see that, after doing our time and effort study, we see that they're actually spending 100% of their time on Program 1. So then you'll see that the total on the bottom row of all of our FTEs, that in total, about 2.25 of our staff is spending time on Program 1 activities, 1.25 on M&G activities, and 1.5 on fundraising activities. And then you see the corresponding salaries and the total cost that could then be assigned to each of those cost centers. So we're going to keep these total allocations in mind as we move into the next method, which is the FTE method. And really what this method does is it takes our personnel allocations and it applies them to non-personnel overhead items. So perhaps you determine that things like maybe your phone bill and your utilities bill, that it's justifiable and, easy to determine that you could allocate those sorts of expenses functionally based on how many people actually use that service, right? How many phone lines you have, et cetera. And so the FTE method takes what we've done with the time and effort reporting and applies it again to non-personnel activities or items. So you'll see here again, remembering from our time and effort reporting that we had 2.25 FTEs that were spending time on Program 1. So about 45% of our total personnel. We had 1.25 FTEs spending time on management and general activities. And then we had 1.5 spending time on fundraising activities. And so you'll see that translate over to 45%, 25%, and 30% respectively of the total phone and utilities bills. So you can see then how we've allocated those costs functionally between the different cost centers. And so that's how you can kind of take that method and apply it to non-personnel expenses. Okay, moving away from our time and effort methodologies and thinking a little bit about some things like rent perhaps, or things that might be allocable based on the amount of space that we have. We're going to talk about the square footage method, and this takes actual square footage of an office space and it applies it functionally across the programs based on the usage. So at the drop-in center, the landing, we used the square footage method to allocate our rent between our programs. And the reason we used square footage method is, by nature of operating a drop-in center, most of our space was actually used for drop-in center activities. And so it just made more sense for us to utilize this method. And in turn, we were actually able to recover more costs through our federal grants by using this particular method versus maybe some of the other methods. So an example here that we have, very for simplistic purposes, we have, a square footage of 1,000 square feet. Maybe we have a rent bill of $10,000 a month. And we're going to throw in utilities here as well at $500 a month. You'll see that in this example, program one, we've taken out our tape measurer, we've gotten the floor plans from our landlord and determined that, program one actually uses 500 square feet of that 1,000 square foot space. And so we're charging $5,000 of that rent bill every month to program one. Maybe our M&G offices account for about 250 square feet. So we're going to charge $2,500, and maybe our fundraising personnel occupy about a quarter of that space also. And so you'll see here how we've allocated that functionally between the three cost centers. Something also to call attention to that I've referenced a couple of times now, but your utilities here, we've used the square footage methodology. We also have an example of how the utilities were allocated functionally between FTE. So again, there's multiple different ways that you can think about your expenses and the allocation of them. But the most important thing is to make sure that they're defendable and that you've clearly articulated the reason why you're using a particular method that translates over to your cost allocation plan. And then the final method that we will use or that we'll talk about is the actual usage method. And this is based on actual usage of a particular asset or a machine. And so in this example, we will use actual usage of a printer as an example. So if you have, a printer or another asset where you're able to track the actual usage between your different programs and functions, this might be a great method for you to use in allocating those expenses. So in this example, let's imagine that we have a monthly output of 1,000 copies on this printer at $1,000 per month for our lease of this printer. And maybe we are able to determine that program one actually, uses or prints 500 of those 1,000 copies on the printer. And so because of that, we're going to charge $500 of that $1,000 per month invoice to program one, so on and so forth. You can see how we've allocated that across the different programs. Okay, so we've talked about 4 different methods up to this point for direct cost allocation. I do want to name that in the 2 CFR, there is also what's called a de minimis indirect rate. For purposes of this webinar, this is a little out of scope, so we're not going to go into the nuts and bolts of what this looks like, but I did want to name that this is something different that you can use that is available to you. And essentially, the de minimis rate is for federal awards. It's a more simple way for you to recover some of your indirect costs, maybe some of those M&G, management and general expenses, without actually going through the process of creating a direct allocation method or doing those, more intense cost calculations. The 2 CFR actually allows you to recover up to 15% using the de minimis rate. It used to be 10%, and that recently changed. There are some specifics around that, of course, with respect to if you already have an existing grant and if you can go back and change that rate. So definitely talk to Mark if you want to learn more about what that looks like. But I did want to call attention to the fact that this is available and it's a different way to think about cost allocation, but also to name that if you're thinking about pursuing this, please be careful not to double dip into utilizing this and also, using some of the direct allocation methods. You want to kind of be careful about making sure you separate those things out so that you're not, counting your administrative expenses twice. Mark, anything that I missed there on the de minimis rate that you want to kind of call attention to?
Got to get myself unmute. No, you've got it right. Again, the 15% starts with the new grants starting in October 1 of this year. So in your audit of your financial statements, you may have two different de minimis rates, one for the old grant that you were on, and then the second one would be for the new grant that you're on, depending on when your calendar year or your year end is, may determine what rates you can use at that point. Go ahead.
Awesome. Okay. So up to this point, we've done a lot of work in talking about the types of costs that we have as an organization, how to determine our allocation method for those various expenses. And finally, we're going to take both of those pieces and document them in the form of a cost allocation plan. And so I've outlined a couple of things to think about as you are drafting your cost allocation plan. The first thing is, of course, stating the purpose and providing a summary of your cost allocation plan. Making reference to some of the different programs or grants that are within scope. And then really the meat of your cost allocation plan will be outlining the allocation method for your different costs. So you're, taking the defined costs, that list that you spent time thinking about, your functional expenses, your programmatic expenses, M&G and fundraising, and then you're essentially just taking those and outlining the different allocation method that you're going to use for each of those expenses. So in this example here, I show that for the personnel expenses for Org X, we're going to be using a direct allocation method that includes wage and benefits, using time and effort reporting to determine those costs functionally. I've also specified that PTO and holiday pay are allocated in this way. So really thinking about kind of the all-in costs that relate to a particular item. And then for rent and utilities, I've called out here for Org X, we're using a direct method to allocate rent and utilities using the square footage allocation. And then for something like this, you may want to include, a screenshot or an appendix of your floor plan, and then kind of an outline of the square footage and how that's allocated across your program. So those are some of the things that you want to think about. Maybe providing as some ancillary documentation to go along with your cost allocation plan to help defend and provide additional detail for why you chose particular methods for your plan. The final thing that I will add about cost allocation plans is you want to review the plan on an ongoing basis. I definitely recommend at least annually, but specifically when you have significant changes to your organization. So maybe you were just awarded a new grant, you're starting a new program, maybe you're sunsetting an old program, but any of those major changes to your organization would warrant the review and potentially revision of your cost allocation plan. Okay. As I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, there are a couple of other allocation methods that I've listed here, the simplified method and the multiple distribution-based method. Again, these really aren't kind of the scope of today's discussion. So if you do have additional questions about them, I recommend, taking a look at the 2 CFR and seeing how those are outlined, and then of course reaching out to Mark for some additional conversation with those other 2 methods. All right, and then Mark sent out some resources earlier this week, which was essentially this slide deck. The very last slide has a couple of sample cost allocation plans, in addition to a link to the 2 CFR 200. I do want to call attention to the fact that some of these cost allocation plans do reference the OMB circulars, which is kind of a more dated reference versus the 2 CFR. So again, when I'm drafting any sort of policy or procedure or plan, I know I always enjoy and like having something to kind of compare or reference as I'm drafting something of that sort. That's really what these resources are meant to do, provide some structure for illustrating, how to create a cost allocation plan. But I did want to note, don't take that language because it is an outdated reference. And so make sure you're referencing the appropriate 2 CFR in that. And that is all that I've officially prepared for cost allocation plans. Happy to talk through any questions or open the floor for additional discussion.
Thank you, Brooke. Before we have any questions, I'd like to say a couple of little different things on that. We at TASA actually use different parts of the methodologies. And the reason I wanted to talk about that is that everybody has, like Brooke said, each organization is different in that regard. So we use the FTEs naturally for personnel, like most people do. For most of our non-personnel, we'll use FTEs again in that situation. Now, we're kind of unique in rent that we will do 2 things within that methodology for rent. We will actually use the floor plan for the square footage. And the reason we use square footage is that we have a lot of people, we have some of our staff that are remote people. Well, we set aside an area for remote people so that whenever remote people come in, they have a location, they have a space to operate in, and we allocate those kind of costs. So in that situation, we will do kind of a 2-step tier in that. We will then allocate by square footage the functional part for our grant and the different grants that we have in the process and what's kind of program or other things like that. And then once we got the square footage set for those different things, then we'll use the FTE methodology to actually come up with an FTE per square foot. And then from that FTE per square foot, we will multiply the per square footage rate to the number of FTEs, and that's how we calculate how much dollars are set aside for the remote people in that situation. And as it goes for us, since we have multiple programs that we have within even our remote people, then naturally the FTEs are then calculated per square footage per FTE times the FTE for each program that we have, or like VOCA, the OHE, other things like that. And that's how we actually get to our costs for those things. So you can have multiple layers of cost allocation. So, it's good to think about what you're trying to allocate and then finding out the best methodology to actually report that. Because when you're looking at that, that's what your allocation methodology is, and that's how you defend that methodology. So when we've had auditors come in and they see that we have different things for, let's say, materials and everything else that's on FTE basis. For rent, it's different because we now say, well, we wanted to clarify a little bit more of what our allocations are for rent. And we haven't had any problems with any of our auditors, whether it's state, federal, our own our own auditor that does our annual audit. So look at that when you're looking at methodologies. Brooke's given you a very good process to do. And you can add or move some of those methodologies, whichever way it fits best for your organization. Roger, do we have any questions at this time?
Nope, not in the chat, but if someone
Not
has
in-
a question, they can ask right now.
Yeah, if you want to ask, use the hand gesture that we have. I think, what is it called?
Well, and while people are thinking about that, Mark,
Yeah.
your comment about the square footage allocation is certainly an interesting one. I feel like as, more organizations are thinking about remote employees, hybrid work, those sorts of things, that certainly, I think, builds a case for having maybe a, more non-traditional or complex allocation method. Also in thinking about like shared spaces too, right? And how those things are allocated. So that's a really great point that you brought up there around hybrid anyways. Any questions or comments? Would love to hear how you guys have used the allocation methods maybe in some different ways. That would be interesting to share with the group.
And as people are thinking about any kind of part of this, also think about, like I said before, any other federal grant kind of topics that you would like to know about or be interested in. Again, you could either put it into the chat, or really, I like when people just email me, because that way I can say, well, we've gotten a whole list of the same kind of topic that makes good for a good webinar to do. And then other times when it's a little bit more specific, specifically when you do an email, you say, well, how do we do this in my organization, and am I compliant? That might lead to just more like a one-on-one meeting for a little bit to discuss that topic. So we're always available for you, and we'll be keeping in touch with our process. We hope that we might do one or two before we get to June. And I think Roger said June 29th is when we start the statewide conference. And the statewide conference is actually, is it in Denton, if I remember correctly?
It's in Denton, yeah.
It's in Denton. So on site, we'll have their conference there. Most of that's really more programmatic. So a lot of our advocates, other groups go to that. But we're now trying to do a little bit more for kind of the finance and compliance section, which we have not really been able to do in quite some time. So I'm really kind of pleased that we're moving that direction. Also, I know that TCFE has a very, very good conference. So what is it? I think for Deborah, are y'all in your 5th or 6th year of the finance conference that happens? And that's another wonderful resource. They will put that on with different speakers that are CPAs or grant specialists or everything else like that. And she usually gets that out to the group on her listserv, and I every now and then will see that, and I will send it further across. So, okay, so the finance conference is in March.
It's in
Mid-March?
February 18th, 19th.
Oh, okay. I didn't see that.
March 19th and 20th
Okay,
at
I'm
March
the Austin
19th and 20th.
Marriott North in Round Rock, Austin, Texas.
Yeah.
Round Rock,
And
Texas.
what is the years? Because I missed it. Well, what happened was the pandemic naturally messed up some of the scheduling and everything. And then right after that, I was really hoping to go to the next one because I've always enjoyed that conference. And I just happened to catch COVID. It took me 2 years before I actually caught it, but it was an inconvenient time because I couldn't make it to to that particular conference. And it's wonderful. I love what y'all do. What is this, your 6th, 7th, or longer than that, Denver? I couldn't.
Deborah, you do have a director's conference on the 18th, 19th, right, in Austin?
I'm not sure of the dates. It's on the website.
Yeah,
Right.
that's the one I was referring to. So,
Yeah, that's the TASA TCFD
right,
Executive Directors Conference.
Right.
that's true. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a little bit different. But for this group, the finance, if you're looking at financial or compliance and everything, that TCFE conference is very good. It's a finance conference, I think is how you called it before, or at least that's what I call it.
Yeah, leading by numbers is what we call it.
Leading by numbers for this year. Great.
That's what we started calling it a few years ago. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for
Leading by numbers.
marketing
I'll
our
remember
event.
that.
And I'll have details out soon about that. It'll be on the website, and I'll send you all the information.
Right. Any other kind of questions, Roger? Have you
Oh,
been
yes,
keeping up
we
with
do. We do have some questions now.
Okay.
RCC does FTE allocations on payroll and expenses. The finance council, if you ever do one direct cost, okay. They want to just know if we have one on the indirect cost. They would like to have a webinar on that. Yeah.
Okay, we will look into that with indirect cost rates. That's one that I know that Thompson's Grants actually put it together. It was actually about 16 hours, and yeah, it takes quite a bit to that. So we may have to do that over a spread of a couple of different webinars. That's the one where, like Brooke was talking about, there's a simplified version, which they call it simplified because it's not multiple stages within the same indirect, but it's still really complex. And when you use that simplified methodology for indirect cost rate, that's typically for programs that are using an indirect cost rate that's greater than 15%, and that needs to be approved by your cognizant agency. For most programs like us, I would think that would be HHSC because they're the biggest agency for federal grants of the nature that we have. I think it's that instead of the Criminal Justice Division. So, and once you request that, you get an interim indirect cost rate that you can use until it gets actually approved. So it takes quite a bit of time. The reason we haven't really talked about it here is that indirect cost rates like that are things that few people use, but it's very good if you have a big indirect cost rates. And usually most indirect cost rates that are bigger than that, the 20%, 25% or so, those are organizations like the counties hospitals, other areas like that, PDs, stuff like that, that have a lot of shared costs for either, let's say, vehicles, fleet of vehicles. How do you charge that out? There could be things of a lot of printing costs that goes like in the universities and everything else. They have a big print shop for things, and those are all sent down to that area. Well, how do you allocate for that cost? And that's where the indirect cost rate probably is a little bit more appropriate to use in those situations. So it's those kind of multi-functional things, facilities where you have several things. That's why I think of universities and hospitals and things like that, where they have facilities that are shared by a lot of different areas within that huge organization. Then you want to use that indirect cost rate to capture that, because that's something that can be very beneficial for organizations. Roger, any other questions?
No, someone shared the conference, TCFP conference, so it's on
Okay.
March 19th to 20th. So
Great.
yeah, that's about it.
Okay. Well, thank you again for everybody having the interest for this. And again, if you have other interests in topics, we'd love to know that so that we could meet y'all's needs at the same time. I think over the years, we've been able to take care of I think what I call the bigger or more critical areas, but there's so much to grants administration and financial management that there's a lot of topics that can be discussed at that point. And everybody has their own kind of particular areas of unique ideas or needs, and we'd like to meet those needs. Okay, since we don't have any more questions or topics or anything, we'll go ahead and start closing this. I will go ahead and stop the recording if I can find it again.